Hello and welcome to the Project Hope podcast for families and friends with a loved one in a group of high demand, high control. I am your host, Jennifer. A lot has changed since I first started this podcast, so I thought I'd add a little to the initial introductions and provide something that's more up to date. I work with survivors of coercive control one-to-one. I also consult with families, and I offer education to the public around such topics. For the full scope of what I offer and also my credentials, you're welcome to check out my website, jennifer-french.com. I have a master's in the psychology of coercive control, and as of August 2024, I've been accepted into a PhD program called Psychology, Policy, and Law, and I'll have a specialty in either criminal behavior or forensic victimology. This will support the work that I currently do as an expert witness in cases involving coercive control. The Project Hope podcast has provided such an amazing opportunity for me to meet many wonderful people, survivors, experts, family members, and it's truly a pleasure to meet each one of these individuals you will hear from. This podcast will conclude with season 2 as I enter into my PhD program, but I have many other exciting things on the horizon, so please stay in touch and go to my website for any and all current events. Thanks to all of you who listen to Project Hope and care about this community. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Kelly Alder to the Project Hope podcast. She's written a book titled The 14th Wife. After the passing of both her parents in her early 20s, Kelly joined a neo-Native American tribe, marrying its leader and becoming one of his many wives. Red Bear was the spirit name given to Kelly during a ceremony held by the tribe's founder, John Two Birds. She began writing her memoir about 5 years ago when a little voice started persistently nagging her to, quote, write this crazy stuff down. And we will discuss this process a bit in the podcast episode, she gave into this call, grabbing moments where she could in between the cooking, laundry, and school runs. And now, to our benefit, she shares her story in this beautifully written memoir. Kelly has received many accolades for the book and also has a blog that you can find at her website, where she writes about life experiences and the topics of femininity, vulnerability, and belonging. Present day, Kelly lives with her family between Cape Town, South Africa, and Zurich, Switzerland. So today she's actually speaking with us from South Africa. Kelly loves to travel and enjoys exploring, as she puts it, far-flung destinations around the globe with her family. And she also enjoys being at home, cooking for friends, and walking her 2 dogs, Willow and Poppy. We did leave some barking out of the podcast, actually, so sorry to you dog lovers for that. You can find Kelly on social media at Instagram at I am Red Bear. And all details, of course, can be found in the podcast notes, including a link to purchase her book, a link to her blog and website. So please do visit kellyalder.com to learn more about Kelly and all that she's sharing with the world. Thank you, Kelly. Welcome to the Project Hope podcast, Kelly Alder. It is such a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm so excited to talk with you, and thank you for having me on your podcast.
You are so welcome. And Kelly, I thought that perhaps I had a thought that for beginning our podcast together, that I felt inspired, if it feels comfortable to you, that I read the dedication for your daughter that you have at the very first page of the book.
Of course. Go ahead, please.
So it says, "For Darcy, there is an emptiness to my life, too many lost stories from parents and grandparents, untold answers to infinite questions. I long to know what their adventures were, what pain and joy they experienced. The cruelty of losing family young is by the time you are mature enough to understand which important questions to ask, it is too late. As I approached the age that my mother was when she died, I felt an urgency to write these notes for my daughter so that she would have a record of the most transformative period of my life. Should she not be ready to ask the right questions before I am gone?"
Yeah.
Kelly, as you know, I was so moved by that when I read it, and just connecting to the power of pain and the power of the giving that sometimes comes from it, and also the appreciation of stories and legacy. And so I felt very touched that this was the dedication to the book. And I wondered if you might just comment on that and sort of your impetus to write it. It sounds like was inspired by your daughter, Darcy.
Yes. So, well, the interest says it all, really. I wanted to write this book for her so she had a record of what happened to me, because I lost my mum when I was 24. I lost both my parents to AIDS. My mum died of AIDS 3 years after my dad. But I think I'll just go into a bit of my family history, if that's okay with you, because I know I want to talk about the cult that I got into, but I think what precedes that is my family history. And I think to understand why I got involved in a cult, you have to understand my family history and to see how that kind of what broke inside me that I needed to explore and to get involved with this kind of strange situation, I guess. So I grew up in southern rural England I was born in the early 1970s, and I really had an idyllic early life. Mum and Dad were young. They were young parents. They were good looking, glamorous, and fun and loving. They adored and doted on my youngest sister and I. Our house was always full of friends, and we were always surrounded by family. Mum and Dad were very social, always throwing parties and dinners and taking us on trips, days out. And we really had a magical childhood. Dad had his own wholesale grocery business, and Mum gave up her work as a ground staff flight personnel at Heathrow Airport in London when she married Dad, and she was a stay-at-home mom, so she was always around. Dad did well, and in the 1980s we enjoyed a life of abundance. Dad was into yachting. He was a keen salesman, so he invested and bought a boat for us and the family, and we had nice cars. And my youngest sister and I went to a quite a privileged private all-girls school. It really was a golden era, and Mum and Dad seemed really in love. I would never see them fight or argue, and from the outside it looked that we had a perfect family life. Dad could be a little withdrawn sometimes, and especially as I hit puberty, I felt him pull away emotionally from me. And I know this, my sister also felt this to be true, but I didn't think too much of it. I think my sister and I both felt closer to my mom than my dad, but we didn't also think too much of that. We just thought this was normal. Things began to go wrong in my late teens. Dad began to spend more time away from home. And when I questioned Mum about this, she would just say he was on boating trips with friends. Then out of the blue, one day he returned from work, packed a bag and left the house. He moved out, he sold the family boat and he used the money to buy a house. He moved in with a younger woman who was just 5 years older than me. I was distraught and confused. I had no idea that my mum and dad's marriage was in such a bad way. My sister and I were angry and hurt, especially as Mum quickly struck up a relationship with an old neighbor who had moved in just a few months after Dad leaving. My world had turned upside down, and I was at college studying interior design, and my college work really suffered. So I would visit Dad at his new house, but I noticed that he looked thin and tired. Mum also was looking stressed and seemed to always be in a bad mood. She seemed to act like she was having some kind of nervous breakdown. The atmosphere in the house at home was awful. I was moody with her. I didn't understand the situation. I didn't understand what was going on. Dad's health seemed to be steadily deteriorating. And my sister and I were told by Mum that he had bowel cancer, but that he was being treated. We were devastated. And over the next few months, his health continued to decline. He lost his eyesight, his retinas detached. He began to have like terrible headaches, crippling headaches. He became very thin. He had terrible sores all over his abdomen, and he needed continual care. A few months later, Mum told us that he was, the end was near, basically. My sister was at university in Glasgow. She called her to come home. She knew that this was, the end of his days and that we needed to come and say goodbye to him. We visited him for the final time on his deathbed in the hospital, and we were dumbfounded to see his skeletal frame in the bed. We felt so confused and unprepared for this sight. We were being kept in the dark, and my mum and dad were my mum was trying to protect us from the truth. I don't know if they had made a conscious decision not to tell us, but we just were so confused and didn't know what was going on. But it was only after this point, after this final visit with my dad, when I confronted my mum and I was like, what is going on, Mum? And then she told me the truth, that my dad didn't have bowel cancer, that my dad had AIDS, and that he had infected her. She was also HIV positive and ill, and had been given about 2 years to live. And of course, I was just like, how did this happen? And then she confided in me that he had been having gay affairs throughout their marriage, and that she had known but hadn't wanted to leave him because she hadn't wanted to break up the family. So this huge bomb went off in my life. Everything I knew about my father completely changed, knowing that my mum was going to die in a year or 2 years, and my life just completely torn apart.
What
so I spent the next
layers of information, just tremendous layers of information.
It's like an atomic bomb.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it was horrendous. And, you just become a different person within a minute. Within 5 minutes, you're a different person. Everything you know, everything you thought you knew, just stripped. And you just, on a cellular level, I remember walking downstairs because we were when she told me, I was lying in bed with her upstairs in her bedroom. And I remember after we were chatting for about 2 hours, crying and hugging each other. And I remember walking downstairs to make her a cup of tea. And I remember walking down the stairs and just everything felt different. Like the air felt different. My footsteps on the stairs felt different. I just thought, my God, life is never going to be the same. Like everything is different. Everything I thought I knew is different. It's like, it's a completely weird feeling, God. So strange.
That, just a total fundamental shift in the world that one has known.
Yeah, exactly. A shock, a huge shock. So, but of course, life goes on and you have to make the best of the time you've got left. So we were there 100%. Dad died literally 10 days later, but I was so angry with him. Mom said, are you going to go back to see him? And I was like, no, I can't. I'm so angry with him. And she was like, she'd already forgiven him, right? She'd been through her processes. She'd had time. So she was like, I've forgiven your father. I've refused to be angry. I've moved on. I don't want you to be angry. I don't want you to hold hate in your heart. I want you to forgive him. But will you go back and see him? I'm like, no, I don't want to. My sister and she told my sister a few days later, we were both so enraged and angry and confused. We didn't go back to see him. So he died, 10 days later. We went to the funeral, of course, but yeah. So then our focus was Mom. Okay. Mom, we cared for her. We stayed with her for the next few years until she died, trying to make the most of the time she had left. So, yeah. So after that, I had this huge hole in my life. And what do you do when you've lost both your parents and you're in your mid-20s? You just go crazy, take lots of drugs, fall in love, you go clubbing, you numb the pain, you just, I wasn't particularly seeking any spirituality at this point. I was just trying to numb and delay the pain as much as I could. I fell in love and had a relationship and got very involved with him and his family. But when that ended, I came crashing down. And at that point, that's when I was searching for something else. I was like, okay, so now I've done the drugs, I've been in love, and that hasn't worked out. So now what? And that's when I met John Tubers through in the book. Quinn, my friend Quinn, she introduced me to this man, who I later found out she was also one of his wives, but she didn't tell me at the time. This medicine man, Native Indian American man who had been touring the UK. He's been based out in New Mexico, but he'd been touring the UK the year, this is 1999 now. Preaching eco-awareness and so I was intrigued to know more, and I was looking for anything to bring me out of my despair. I was looking for a family and a sense of belonging. I was desperate to find a way out of my loneliness. He was very charismatic, and he seemed to make a beeline for me. He could sense that I was vulnerable. I spent that summer of 1999 in the UK following him and attending his workshops, weekends, where we would train in the sweat lodge ceremonies mainly. Each time I saw him, he would single me out, give me special attention, and make sure he made me feel special in some way. The joy I felt towards him seemed very real and almost guttural. It was like nothing I'd ever experienced before. He seemed to have some kind of power over me. He could unnerve me, and sometimes I would feel my body shake when listening to him lecture or speak. I don't know if it was fear-based, but at that time I interpreted these physical signs as like a validation of my destiny to be with him.
Yeah.
John Tubert, he instructed his wives to set up a meeting where one of the senior wives told me that I was signed, meaning destined to become one of his woman wives. I was so deeply kind of into it. By then, I felt like I had no choice to agree. So in October that year, I traveled to New Mexico, knowing that once I got there, I would be obliged to marry him. On arrival, John wanted me to marry him that night, but I insisted we wait until the next day. I discovered later on that John...
And Kelly, may I ask, was the hesitancy there that you just needed a little more time to even really adjust to getting used to that idea, to imagining that it might happen? Even in reading the book, it sounded like you weren't totally convinced that you wanted to be married yet.
Yeah, I was just like bamboozled. I was just like bamboozled and like, what is going on? And I just thought, I just arrived. I'm like smelly and sweaty from the flight. And I just thought, my God, at least let me have a night's sleep before. Yeah, I just needed some time to assimilate what was going on. I never thought that I would get off a plane and then straight into a marriage ceremony. Just the thought was insane to me. So when he said that, I was just like thinking, you are crazy, at least wait till tomorrow. You're crazy.
Yeah. Well, and it was also my impression that while you knew that he had received some sort of spiritual guidance, that you had a connection, that you should essentially be with him in this life on this plane, that there wasn't an agreement necessarily from your end that you said yes to that marriage. So when you were actually arriving, it was kind of to experience this like
apprenticeship.
Yeah, apprenticeship. Yeah. And then he made the assumption that you were there as a yes to the actual marriage ceremony.
Yeah, I mean, he never got down on one knee and said, "Hey, will you be my wife?" It was all very kind of, innuendo, and it was discussed. It was discussed in the UK through his senior woman wife.
Yeah.
He would like you to be his wife, and then, will you come to New Mexico? But it wasn't ever discussed openly. When you arrive in New Mexico, John will be marrying you as soon as you arrive. That was never on the that was never openly discussed. But this was the way with him. He was very indirect. The whole thing was clothed in mystery, and he never answered questions directly, and it was very frustrating. So that was just the way he operated. So I wasn't 100% surprised when he asked me, but I did put my foot down.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and it's interesting to me that, so it's funny. I just, for the first time, sort of made this connection also upon hearing you say the word signed, that you're signed to him. Signing is kind of like something you do when you're creating a contract, right? So it's sort of this manipulative terminology of that you do have a contract. And then also the interesting layers of communications that were going through the wives, and also kind of using Quinn to get information about you, to know where you were at, to understand where your mind was at and how you were feeling about all of this, and to kind of draw you in. it's sort of interesting, like in retrospect, do those elements feel like they were manipulative to you, or how have you kind of landed with that element?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, Quinn was such a dear, close friend of mine, and I really, to this day, don't believe that she was maliciously, I mean, I hate that word grooming, but I don't believe that she was intentionally grooming me in any way whatsoever. She was just involved in this.
Through the book, I feel that.
Yeah.
Capture the friendship. And that's why I think this is so interesting. And I love that your book and this story gives light to how kind of insidious the manipulation could be, where you don't even feel it, or people don't even realize it's going on, because it seems very obvious.
Yeah. That was intentional, because throughout the book, I wanted to put almost people in a time capsule of when I didn't want to write the book with my brain now. I wanted to write the book with my brain then. And I didn't want to write the book and say, oh yeah, she was grooming me and you can see what was happening here. I wanted to write the book with my eyes then. And I also didn't want to accuse anyone. You know, I didn't want to make anyone look bad, but I didn't want to make anyone's mind up. I want the reader to make their own mind up, but I didn't want to accuse anyone in the book of anything. I just want to describe what happened to me as I saw it through my eyes in my 20s, as it was at that age. And I hope I've achieved that.
Oh, Kelly, you do a beautiful, beautiful job at that. I mean, it's really, I love when that happens, when writers are telling these stories around these particular kinds of experiences, because I really think it helps people, because who can't relate to everything that you wrote? Who can't relate to the woman that you were at that time? I mean, It's so easy to relate to you in your innocence, in your pain, even in the maturity. And honestly, when as much pain as you were in when you actually went to New Mexico for the first time, to be honest with you, I felt really impressed about your moments of kind of standing up to John or questioning something, it actually was quite in your own in-tuneness and power that you did actually have a voice. And I'm sure there are moments, of course, of intimidation, or where you don't say something or what have you, you hold back, but it was also, it says something to me about you and your strength of how you dealt with that in the moment. I mean, I could see many of us just kind of going, okay. Okay.
Yeah.
And it goes across the mouth,
Yeah. So, yeah. Anyway, I did marry him. I was wife number 14, and I had to consummate the marriage that night, which I wasn't looking forward to, but I did it. I don't know how, but I did it. And I spent the next 5 weeks at the compound, taking part in, learning how to do pipe ceremony, making my own pipe, training for Vision Quest, taking part in sweat lodge ceremony, adhering to the strict codes of conduct around the house. There was strict rules for who would be doing which chores around the house. There were cooking chores and cleaning chores and, communal living, basically learning how to live in a commune. And we would have gun practice. He was very into survival. He was a Vietnam vet, so he had that kind of like bossy army philosophy where he would shout and bully and run the place like an army camp. So yeah, it was quite stressful. He was kind of mentally abusive, and the other wives weren't all that friendly. John was constantly trying to convince me to stay and have children with him. But eventually I felt a strong pull to go back to London. But I was very torn about what to do. And through desperation, one night I pleaded with my mum, my deceased mum, to help me. And she appeared to me in a dream and told me to get out. So I went with my gut feeling and this vision and remembered the love of my mother. And it was the thing that I could cling on to that I knew was real. And that helped me to make my decision. And I got out and I left. I mean, I wasn't under lock and key. I was able to get a flight home. And I left. I mean, when I went back to London, I was scared. I thought, what am I returning to? I had no boyfriend, no real place to live. I sold my apartment in London. I had kind of lost contact with some of my friends. I had no job, and I was leaving this ready-made family. So it was scary to leave, but I knew it was the right thing to do.
That is such an incredible part of the story, just the desperation of reaching out to your mother and how she responded in that way, and I think also it's just a testament to the power of love, that when we really know what that is, that even with your mother not being physically present on the earth anymore, that power still holds,
Yeah. I mean, that was a true spiritual experience, Forget the sweat lodges, forget the vision quest. That was a spiritual experience.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I know you wanted to talk about since the book has been published, what communication I've had with.
Yes. Well, one of the things that I wanted to ask you about also your time with John that I thought was really interesting is at one point you mentioned the term with him that he was living in a personal fantasy. And I thought that was really an interesting term to use because I've never quite heard it put that way. And I thought how that so precisely applies to so many leaders of groups that are really insular and tend to be controlled by that leader. That it's kind of like a personal fantasy that's being created with all the players as a part of your chessboard.
Yeah, I use that term a lot when describing John. I always say that, or I describe him as having created his own ego-driven fantasy.
Yeah. So interesting. Yeah, so then I did want to ask you a little bit about if you did continue a relationship with Quinn and, of course, protecting privacy. I wondered if anyone else had kind of reached out to you with the publishing of the book to share, or if there were, I know you share one anecdote in the note from author section of the book. So I really appreciated that. I always find it so interesting, even for me doing this podcast, it's been really fascinating who has kind of come out of my past to approach me about, a variety of different things, right? Wanting to talk about whatever. But it's been really fascinating. And I was certainly thinking of you, just knowing that, the book is public and that this is the first time that you're sharing this element of the story, and knowing that John Two Birds, that scope of the mark that he made or the people that he touched was probably larger than the kind of characters or people that we come across in your book.
Yeah, so Quinn, I was in touch with for quite a while after I left. We were still very close when I came back. We came back together, actually, from New Mexico.
Yeah.
And I was very close to her still for quite a while. But then we drifted apart a little bit, but we still remained in contact. Even up until I had my daughter, we still saw each other in London quite regularly. But then since the book came out, she wasn't happy with me, and understandably, she's kind of dropped all contact with me, even though I changed her name and details. She doesn't want anything to do with me anymore. But that's, I understand, and that's okay, and I'm of course I'm sad, but it's okay.
Yeah.
It's something I had to do, and if these things happen,
right.
But the most significant communication has actually come from one of John's daughters, who was only a small child when I was out in New Mexico, and whose name I shall keep private. She contacted me just before the book was published last year, sending mildly aggressive toned emails, sort of kind of what do you think, who do you think you are kind of emails. And she had seen my website and I think was worried about the book coming out.
Yeah.
However, we began to communicate by email, and she softened, and I offered to send her a copy of the book, and she accepted.
Yeah.
So once she had read it, she emailed me back, and she was surprised that only a third of the book was about her father, and that it mostly focused on my early life and the loss of my parents. That was a surprise to her. I think she was like, oh my God, it's going to be a huge expose about my family and my father, and it's all going to be lies. And anyway, she was surprised about that. She told me that she believed her father, John Two Birds, was a spiritual salesman, a master at fooling people who ruled by fear, and that he had a master's in psychology, something that I didn't know. So he was very clever at manipulation, using the ideas of communal living and being in balance with nature to attract people who are disenchanted with the ways of the Western world, or who are vulnerable, broken, like I was.
Yeah.
She told me that he was badly abused as a child, something I didn't know, that he had PTSD. And before he set up Terra Mata, his organization, that he used to scam wealthy white people.
Wow.
Apparently he used to do real ceremony, authentic ceremony with his own people, but then how somehow along the way this changed, and he began to use his spirituality for his own ego-driven fantasy.
Wow.
So this communication with John's daughter has been a revelation for me. When I had previously attempted to contact two of his wives, I was met with a frosty response.
I am delighted to offer you Pure Haven products. All proceeds received go right back to the Project Hope podcast. I myself have been using these pure, safe, and toxin-free products for over 4 years, and I absolutely love knowing that my home has countertops that my little niece and nephew can eat off of, without worrying that they have a handful of chemicals being placed in their mouths. The cleaning products are some of my favorites. The glass and surface cleaners smell amazing as well. So if this is of interest to you, please go to purehaven.com/Jennifer French. The link is also included below with information about this podcast segment.
They were wary of me, and perhaps understandably so. They were hostile, perhaps afraid of what the book might reveal. So to have my experience validated by a family member was a huge deal. She has since distanced herself from her family and her father, believing her father to be an abuser, and is coming to terms with her childhood experience.
Wow. That's intense. But I mean, also so interesting, Kelly, the gift that she gave you. And I'm sure there are elements of your book that have been a gift for her as she expands in her own healing process, figuring out, that element of her whole history. It's really...
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine. She's such a brave, intelligent girl, and she was only 5 years old when I was there, and I can't imagine what it must have been like to grow up in that environment. I mean, I had such a privileged childhood, and she had to grow up in a communal environment with a father who had married all these, had so many wives, and must have been extremely difficult. Plus, John died in 2010, so she also lost her father in her late teens. So, it's also another tragedy she had to bear.
Yeah. I was also curious when I did look up John Two Birds. I was able to find some information, but I'm assuming maybe because of his passing, there really isn't a ton of information. And I wonder kind of what sort of legacy he had left behind. But it seems like I wondered if it was because it was the immediate group was so insular that maybe it just didn't expand in a way. And of course, that was sort of pre-major internet stuff.
Yeah. It was pre-internet, and it was, I think by the time he died, I think there were only a couple of wives left, and I think the whole organization had pretty much fizzled out by the time he died. So I think by the sounds of it, it was fizzling out pretty much a few years after I left. So in the early 2000s, I think it sounded like it was fizzling out quite quickly, and his health was deteriorating quite quickly as well. So, I think that's a factor. And also the two wives that remained, I think they were quite secretive.
Yeah. And do you mind my asking, I'm also wondering now, when Quinn actually called you to let you know about his passing, what was your experience kind of in that moment? Did it shift anything for you, or?
No, because to be quite honest, I'd kind of pushed everything away quite deeply, because at that point I had been married. I'd been in the relationship with my husband for almost 10 years, and I had pushed this whole experience away, packed it away so deeply. I hadn't even begun writing the book yet, so I had packaged it away nice and neatly somewhere deep inside me, almost forgotten about it. So by the time Quinn called me to tell me he had passed, I didn't really have any reaction. I was, okay.
Yeah, it was sort of like you had been done already. And then how interesting that then we know from the from kind of the follow-up component of the book, written, I think, after the book was finished, that I know what I was looking at. Actually, it was in your like notes of appreciation to different people. And I noticed when you thanked your husband that you also just thanked him kind of for the being with you and the emotional support around the roller coaster ride of writing this book and going through that again. And I know that you share that it was quite many years later that you even shared with your husband this time in your life. And I'm wondering if you can speak to kind of how that even emerged after it had been sort of shut down for so long, and then what that experience was like for you. I mean, the writing of it and going through that, and just what that was for you, the sorting and the revisiting of the history. It's got to be emotional.
It was quite a ride. Quite a ride. I mean, I never thought I would write a book. But after the birth of my daughter in 2010, something stirred in me, and I felt a deep need to write my story. Kind of like a little voice kept telling me, "You've got to write this down." I felt like she had the right to know everything about her mum and everything I went through. So in 2013, when she was about 3, I just sat down at my desk one day and began writing my book, because I was just sick of this little voice telling me, "You got to write a book, you got to write a book."
And had you
just
told
began.
your husband even prior to that? Had you even told your husband at this point, or were you just kind of getting?
Oh, no, I told him I was writing a book, yeah, but I hadn't told him. And he knew all about that I was in a cult, but he didn't know I was married to the leader.
Okay.
So I began writing the book. He knew all about that. So, and initially it was just going to be a book, a personal project, a book for my daughter. But as I began writing it, it kind of took on a life of its own, and it began to be this kind of bigger project. And I began to realize that this was something that I wanted to put out into the world. And I thought, okay, I really want to put this out into the world, and I want everyone who wants to read this story. And then I realized that, okay, I'm going to have to come clean, because I actually hadn't told anyone. I mean, I hadn't told my husband, I hadn't told anyone. I hadn't told my sister, I hadn't told any of my friends.
Yeah.
No one knew that I had married John Two Birds except for Quinn. So, of course, when you write a memoir, you have to be honest about everything. You can't edit a memoir. So I thought, okay, if I'm going to write a memoir, I have to be honest. And so I'm going to have to tell my husband. So the book took a long time to write. It took 6 years. So when I got to the later stages of the book, I just sat down with him one day and gave him an edit to read. And I was like, he was like, "Oh, so you married? You actually married this guy?" And I was there. But he took it very well. I mean, he was surprised, of course, but he took it very well. And my friends were shocked, of course, but they all took it very well, and they understood. And it was great to have this big secret out at last. I could be honest with everyone and could let this big secret out that I've been holding on to for all these years.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It was a liberating experience.
Amazing.
And very healing. I mean, to write this book over 6 years, when you write a book, you have to do several drafts. And of course, it's painful to revisit. Writing the early bits about my childhood was blissful, of course. I love that. But of course, writing about my parents' illnesses, the deaths, and the trauma and the depression I went through, the misery, the pain of my 20s, and the loneliness and the feeling suicidal and the depression and you relive it on a cellular level, and you go through it all again, and it takes, you process it, and you dream, and you remember things that you thought you'd forgotten, and you it's a ride, but it's healing, and you cry and you cry and cry, and then one day you don't cry anymore, and then you feel lighter, and you can laugh, and it's great.
Oh my goodness. Amazing. And so was there a difference for you in kind of the writing process, and that, reliving it and going through the pain of it and then the freedom of it? And then what was the experience of actually putting it into the world where it's public now?
I was so nervous. I mean, I think I lost about 5 kilos that week I published. I was eating, but it was just like going straight through me. Oh my God, I self-published. So I didn't have a publisher behind me. So I think that's almost worse, because it's all on you. But yeah, I mean, it was great. I've never felt such a high, but I've never felt so nervous. Yeah, I got a lot of interest, which was great. And I got amazing feedback from strangers and friends, from childhood friends. And it was great. It was an amazing time. And I'm very, very grateful that I had such a good response.
Well, I'm certainly not surprised. So beautifully written. It really is. It's so accessible. And I also feel like it's beautifully written, but there are also these sort of phases of your life that I feel like the exposure of that is such a gift to others, because I'm sure almost anybody could approach this book and there would be some element of the life phases that you describe that they would be able to relate to, if not from loss alone, but certainly in terms of relationships and the chaos of life and the 20s. And, it's really, there are just so many dimensions to it. It truly is not just a story about being kind of sucked in by a charismatic leader. It's about
more. I think it's also it's a bit of a kind of coming of age guide, and that's also why it's dedicated to my daughter. It's also what it's like to fall desperately in love, what it's like to take too many drugs, what it's like to feel depressed, what it's like to lose someone, and to what it's like to be hoodwinked by someone, and to know that you can get through it and you can come out of it, and to have, to know that it's okay to say no and have your own voice, and you can feel, you can be at a very low point and you can get through it, So hopefully when my daughter's old enough to read it, she'll get something out of it.
Yeah.
Or anyone who feels those things will get who's been through those experiences will get something out of it.
Yeah. And may I ask, does your daughter know about it? Know about the book and understand?
I've never tried to hide it from her. So I've always talked openly about it. I haven't tried to, shush, she's in the room, not talk about it. So she's grown up for the last 7 years. She's 11 now. So she's grown up now for the last few years, hearing me talk about it openly in the room. So it's kind of seeped into her consciousness, and she knows I was in a cult. She knows I was married. She just is not allowed to read the book because she's not old enough, but she knows everything. And it's never been a big shock to her. It's just slowly seeped into her consciousness. So she's not like, oh, you were married to someone else, or you were in a cult. She's just heard it continuously since she was young. So it's kind of normal for her. Oh my, mum was in a cult,
It's interesting.
It's normal for her.
Yeah, it strikes me when you say that, and I hope it's okay for me to share my impression here, but it's striking me right now that you are functioning in a way that just feels different from how your parents were with you, kind of in that openness where there's no need for secrets.
No need for secrets. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Kelly, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you. And the book is so wonderful. Really, I so recommend it. And I'm looking forward to more people purchasing it from this podcast. So thank you for sharing your story and yourself. And I just very much appreciate that you're here.
And I just wanted to say to your listeners that if they haven't listened to your 1 and 2 podcast with you recording your story, that it's so beautifully read and heartfelt, and it's one of the most touching things I've listened to in a long time. So I really recommend, if you haven't listened to that, do. And don't edit that out, please. Keep that in.
Doing well, thank you. That's so sweet.
Thank you for having me.
You're so welcome.
Hello, listeners. Thank you for joining us at the Project Hope podcast for my conversation with Kelly Alder. I so enjoyed my time with her and hope you found the episode as fascinating as I found her story to be. For the outro today, I've decided to do my best addressing a question that we had from a listener. This actually came from someone who I was able to speak with. She sincerely expressed to me a line of questioning that I am very familiar with and is very understandable. That whether you're a family member of a loved one in such a group or someone listening who hasn't themselves experienced the phenomenon of getting pulled into, drawn into, wooed into an unhealthy relationship, dynamic, or group, that it's really hard sometimes for people to understand how one would stay in something that to others on the outside of that relationship or group can sometimes see it's unhealthy before the one who's in it understands that for themselves. For many of you as our listening audience, it's also really not surprising to me that even after listening to stories from individuals who are obviously super intelligent, it may still be challenging to make sense of why people join and how they stay. And it seems to make little sense in the face of all that's being taken from the individual, as it seems to follow no distinct personality profile or traits, as research shows. Thus far, you have someone like Kelly who knows exactly why she was so susceptible to the allure of John Two Birds. She was in the deep grief of having lost her parents. She had lost her first experience of true love and was, well, as she says, really without purpose and even depressed. Many of you have heard me refer to my own story in that I felt quite on top of my game when I met the leaders of my cult, and yet after a single day of exposure to them, something resonated so deeply within me that I recognized it as a calling, something I had already known and felt within for many years, really. And they put words to the mystical and helped acknowledge it in me, providing me with the language and concepts to call it forth. And also I do need to say here, to just maintain my own personal integrity around my story, that while I felt like I was in an awakening and deeply transformative process, certain teachings and even spiritual rituals were used to abuse, to violate, and to control. So you have examples of someone like Andy Fellows, who got lured in from online content at a time of vulnerability. You have people sharing with us also like Jen Kiaba and Gabby Locke, who were born in or indoctrinated in during early years as part of a familial upbringing. You have people like Joel Pitney, who actually read the expose of former students exposing his leader, and he engaged anyway with open eyes. The stories, both told and untold, are tremendous and vast. So what is it that happens that leads a person to join and or stay in a relationship or group dynamic that has an undercurrent of insidious, abusive, and subtle or not so subtle manipulation taking place? So I'm going to do my best to answer this. And let's keep in mind, of course, that every individual is different. They enter into a cult with a group of high control, high demand, with their own history, their own filter through which they understand and comprehend things. And of course, each group is slightly different and yet also very similar in terms of the principles I'm about to discuss. So fundamentally, people are attracted to these groups because almost always there's some element of self-betterment that they offer. So this could be spiritual, it could be self-improvement, it could even be religious or political. It could be under the guise of professional betterment, but it often comes down to truly believing one is helping themselves and most often the world as well. So add the experiential to this, where people are having spiritual experiences, which can be very powerful. This was certainly the case for me, that I was engaging in experiences that I knew were real and that really no one could take away from me because they were between me and the creative force, God, whatever you want to call it, the cosmic consciousness of creation. And I knew that, and I knew that that was real. And so that was a very big draw. I think a lot of others have had similar experiences to that, and then there are some that have not. But they may also feel loved in a way that they've never experienced before, feeling camaraderie and connection. And this sense of community is also a really powerful element, not only in just kind of drawing the person in and the feelings of community, but also then in what transpires to keep one kind of trapped in the group. So sometimes people do join looking for community, and sometimes the community aspect is a wonderful and welcome surprise. As most of us know from life experience, it's amazing to find people who care about similar things as you do. In my case, I recognized early on that I was meeting and getting to know people in a way that was intimate and personal and vulnerable, and these were all things that I really valued with best friends. Due to the hierarchy and structure, while that created something very unhealthy, the reliability of clarity in relating to others was often refreshing. After all, certainty is one of those core human qualities that we all tend to seek. So even though the hierarchy bred what I would call a sickness in the teachers of blinded pride without any checks and balances monitoring their authority, and as Kelly Alder put it, they created a personal fantasy. I loved that terminology, because that was certainly my experience, that we were all kind of living together in this isolated reality that was the personal fantasy of those two teachers that we were following. And the world outside began to slowly slip away, and the others, or the outside world, begin to be what's actually foreign. So most unhealthy groups create an us versus them mentality. So while you're in a phase of loving your group, the messaging begins to build that the other is somehow less than. And again, that's sort of a subtlety that people have a hard time seeing and picking up on. when they're in all the love, and all the messages seem to come back to supporting that message of love. Okay, so how does all this happen? It happens in the mind and heart, and there's constant reinforcement of all the newness being introduced, some subtle, some overt. So I think this is where we have to acknowledge the psychological manipulation in the form of what's often labeled as coercive control. Here's a very quick and high-level understanding of our history with coercive control that might help us shed some light on why the public still has such a difficult time understanding how and why people join cults. Though I also want to comment here that it is my belief that the incredible programming that's coming out now about cultic groups is a wonderful service to the public. It's my belief and really hope that through film we get to see and understand the unfoldment of the how. And so I hope the programs like Leah Remini and Mike Rinder's series on Scientology, the recent case with Keith Raniere from Nexium, and the series released in response to that called The Vow and Seduced, amidst many other wonderful, wonderful programs, really allow the viewer to enter into the world of the group mind. In fact, the recent docuseries released on the BBC on Amazon is the story of Andrew Cohen and his group, Enlighten Next. And you may recall that Joel and Laura Pitney participated in this group, and Joel is in fact in the docuseries. But what's interesting about this one is that they actually interview Andrew Cohen recently, and the viewer really gets to sit with both the leader and the ex-students to understand what happened and to hear where Andrew's mentality is at right now. I'll leave my opinion out and let you all ponder that one yourselves after you watch it if you're interested. And I will stick to the topic of the historical context around coercive control. So hopefully this will help a little to understand kind of where we're at as a society, and what changed as this concept got introduced. So really, the term coercive control was popularized by Evan Stark in 2007 when he wrote a book by that title, and introduced this idea, or really popularized it for the first time. It was really brought to light and is spoken of by Evan Stark within this context of domestic violence. So that really is where he, that's the arena in which he speaks to coercive control. It comprises a range of behaviors beyond physical and emotional abuse. And abusers often use violence, intimidation, degradation, and isolation to deprive victims of their rights to physical security, dignity, and respect. The term describes a course of oppressive behavior grounded in gender-based privilege. While all forms of abuse are about power and control, coercive control is a strategic form of ongoing oppression and terrorism, really, that invades all arenas of women's activity by limiting access to money and other basic resources. In addition, few elements of coercive control are currently considered criminal. Only crimes, when committed against strangers, are seen as that or qualify, which really further complicates this issue within the context of domestic violence. So just to be clear, coercive control refers to abuse as a strategic course of oppressive behavior. So this means that the battering is rational, instrumental behavior, and not a loss of control. It's ongoing rather than episodic. And it's based on multiple tactics like violence, intimidation, degradation, isolation, and control. 60 to 80% of abused women experience coercive control beyond physical and emotional abuse. So coercive control is in fact a violation of rights and liberties protected by the U.S. Constitution and international human rights conventions, including the right to physical security, so that's addressing violence, to live without fear, that's addressing the intimidation, to dignity and respect, which is addressing the degradation, to social intercourse, which is addressing the isolation, and to autonomy, liberty, and personhood. And that's addressing the control. So over time, victimization and dependence are replaced by domination, subordination, agency, and resistance. So essentially, the emphasis shifts from what men do to women to what they keep women from doing. And we've now graduated to the incorporation of this principle, this researched understanding, into law. In the U.S., California State Senator Susan Rubio has been fighting for domestic violence victims since she took office in 2018. And as a survivor herself, Rubio has been working to pass tougher laws to provide more protection for victims. So one piece of legislation she authored has actually changed the state's view of domestic violence by adding this term coercive control to the family code. Rubio says it wasn't until her own personal experience with domestic abuse that she realized many of the flaws in our current laws. And this is a quote from her. "It's a pattern that even someone as literate and knowledgeable and full of resources like myself could fall victim to domestic violence. So it could happen to anyone." Rubio worked on the legislation with actress and domestic violence survivor Evan Rachel Wood. She's actually been in the media very recently. She came out about the identity of her abuser, which she kept quiet about for a long time. And Rubio also says, this is a quote by her, "We are so used to seeing bruises on someone, a black eye on someone. And this in particular reshapes the way we see domestic violence victims. It's not just a black eye or a bruise." And many of you may be familiar with this. Actually, Serena Williams also did an ad campaign around this principle. So this messaging is definitely getting out into kind of more mainstream society. But Rubio also explains that coercive control is a subtler form of abusive behavior that's often overlooked when a victim testifies against their abuser. It occurs when the abuser isolates a victim from friends and family, takes over their personal finances, surveils a victim's activities, or uses verbal attack to reinforce authority. Another quote by her is that the real strength of the bill is being able to use the pattern of abuse as part of your testimony in court. So that is a really big deal. And this is why I wanted to create a little historical perspective, just so we can all understand that this principle of coercive control was widely accepted in 2007, but it hasn't been until September of 2020 that the concept of coercive control was passed into legislation in California, again by Senator Rubio, and Hawaii. Now it looks actually like New York City is making good headway on the law there. But let's just process this for a moment through a lens when we consider this historically. It took about 13 years of us living with the understanding of coercive control until we've even seen it incorporated into 2 states in the US. We've had a Me Too movement that's brought huge awareness, and yet we're seemingly not that far along legally. And this is all to say our country has a great awareness and care for women in domestic violence situations. This is widely considered extremely unacceptable in our present day society. And yet, even with our understanding of coercive control, even with the horrifying statistics around domestic violence, we only have 2 states to date, this is June 2021, currently incorporating this principle into the law. So while high control group dynamics are complex, they are also relatively distinct, and at the core exists coercive control. So perhaps it's easier initially to understand the captivity of being held in a cult or high demand group if we understand how they keep one attached to the leader or group vision while employing multiple tactics that render one unable to think critically. And we've talked previously about the double bind. In my case, for example, I knew that if I left the group, not only could I expect, I also knew that I would be then ostracized. So that's a bit of a detractor, that you lose the whole world and life and connection to any of the people that you have been invested with and care about and love. But I also knew that if I left, not only could I expect that very bad things would happen to me, in fact, I was directly told what my downfall would look like if I left. For me, the worst thing that I had to face was the message that I would be leaving God and my vow of service to God. And while honestly, today, this sounds like a ridiculous joke, because that relationship is an individual relationship, and that vow is an individual vow between one person and their creator that really cannot be taken away by anyone else. I was absolutely convinced that the teachers had the power to do that, because they made it very clear to all of us that when a priest would leave the organization, they would, quote unquote, strip us of our priesthood. So at the time, that was a devastating threat to me, and it truly shook my entire foundation. So for me, it really came down to making a choice to betray God. And I had to resolve this within myself in order to even consider walking away. In many cases, people literally believe they might die if they leave, physically or spiritually. And you might also imagine that it's very hard to turn against oneself, against the beliefs that you believe because you took them on, if you're still thinking that that group mission is right. because a lot of times people can kind of split as they're leaving. It's like it's so much to take in that one leaves thinking it's because of all the things that were wrong with them. And the group is actually right and good and elite, and the individual just couldn't cut it. That's also a typical way in which one might leave, and you've heard that in some of our podcast stories as well. Also, group dynamics, as well as the dynamic between the individual with the teacher guru, all support a specific way of thinking, doing, and being. And we know from studies that group dynamics and authoritarian figures have a powerful sway over individuals. And I'm not going to go too far down this rabbit hole right now, but if you are interested and you're not familiar with the studies done by Milgram, often referred to as the Milgram experiment, or Zimbardo's work with the Stanford Prison experiment, or the Asch conformity experiment, be sure to check those out. So the community itself takes on a life of its own. And often people, upon initially feeling the tremendous love, respect, and enjoyment from the community, this behavior, sometimes referred to as love bombing, in which the individual will receive lots of praise, encouragement of different forms from group members or from the leaders. But over time, that will change. And to use more of group language within these organizations, people will quote unquote be held accountable, which really just turns into peer pressure, as well as monitoring one another. So the group will basically be used to condone a particular mind think and also report on one another, creating kind of a self-sealed container that's being monitored. In addition, these unhealthy environments will often result in trauma bonds between the individual and the leader or the group. The principles of manipulation, such as gaslighting or double binds, will keep people confused and unable to think critically. And that's a very big deal. That's why you sometimes see sleep deprivation come into the descriptions of people's group experience, because a lot of these tactics are specifically designed to disable that element of critical thinking. So I hope this wasn't too much information, but I wanted to attempt to answer this question of why and how people get in and stay in, using just the principle of coercive control as the centerpiece, by which we can acknowledge that the manipulation is repetitive in nature. And while coercive control was created by Evan Stark to be applied specifically to domestic violence, it really does apply to cults and unhealthy groups. At this point, it is barely recognized by law in the US and minimally in the UK. And it's my belief that as these concepts become more generally understood, it will filter into cult cases as well. We will no longer have to wait until a cult leader does something definitively illegal to hold them accountable for the horrendous psychological violations and manipulations, using concepts, rituals, the spiritual, and this includes spiritual teachings, the group members, money, property, isolation, and so much more to keep someone trapped without even knowing it. As we continue to explore together, please share with me what you're thinking, pondering, what you'd like to know or hear about. This is for you, friends, and may this podcast help ease a little suffering in knowing today that you're not alone. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Project Hope podcast. If you enjoyed it, please feel free to subscribe and comment. You can always get in touch with me at jennifer-french.com. And please let me know any specific topics of interest. And of course, I'm always interested in your stories, whether you've left an organization of high demand, high control, or if you're an individual struggling with the knowing that someone you love is in such a situation. I am here for you. Think critically, take heart, and be free.